Make yourself comfortable. Let the evening slowly grow quieter around you. Whatever happened today can begin to drift a little farther away. There is no need to return to old conversations, unfinished tasks, or thoughts about tomorrow morning. For now, you can simply listen. Feel the surface beneath you gently supporting the weight of your body. Let your shoulders soften. Allow your arms and hands to become pleasantly warm and heavy. Take a slow breath in and let it leave just as gently. Beyond the window, the sky is growing dark. Somewhere in the distance, the wind is settling. The last quiet rustling can be heard in the grass, and above the rooftops and trees, the stars are beginning to appear. They are in no hurry. They do not need to shine more brightly or come any closer to the earth. It is enough for them simply to remain where they are. And among those distant lights, not far from the North Star, lies the constellation of Cepheus. Its brightest stars form a simple shape, rather like a small house with a pointed roof. But long ago, people looking into the northern sky imagined something else. They saw a king seated upon a celestial throne. And his story began many centuries ago, in an ancient kingdom beside a warm and restless sea. High above the shore stood a city of pale stone. Its sunlit walls descended toward a sheltered harbor, where fishing boats moved gently upon the water. Each morning merchants raised awnings over their stalls. Craftsmen carried their work into open courtyards, and the scent of freshly baked bread escaped through windows into the narrow streets. Even during the hottest part of the day, the shaded lanes remained cool. Children ran between stone columns. Women hung clean fabric beneath the sun. Sailors sat beside the harbor repairing their nets and telling stories about islands far beyond the horizon. Above the city stood the palace of King Cepheus. He was not the wealthiest ruler in the ancient world, and he had little desire to be remembered for distant conquests. He cared more about keeping enough ships in the harbor, enough grain in the city stores, and enough peace for his people to light their evening lamps without fear. Every morning Cepheus stepped onto the palace terrace and looked out across the sea. He had learned to read the water almost as others read a familiar face. When the horizon turned silver, he expected a clear and gentle day. When the sea darkened before sunrise, he sent word to the fishermen, warning them not to sail too far from shore. Sometimes his daughter Andromeda joined him there. She would arrive almost silently, still sleepy, her hair loose around her shoulders, and stand beside him at the stone railing. "What do you think about when you look so far away?" she once asked. Cepheus smiled. "I think about how the sea is always larger than our worries." Andromeda grew quiet, as though carefully placing those words somewhere inside her memory. Then she turned toward the horizon and watched it with him. Cepheus treasured those mornings. When Andromeda was beside him, he did not have to choose the perfect words or appear wiser than he truly felt. They could stand together without speaking, and their silence was enough. Andromeda grew into a kind and thoughtful young woman. She knew the palace servants by name, and often wandered down to the harbor to listen to the stories of old sailors. Visitors spoke often of her beauty, but the people of the city loved her for another reason. She possessed the rare gift of noticing how others felt. If a child was crying beside the road, she stopped. If someone struggled beneath the weight of a heavy basket, she offered her hands. And when a person trusted her with some private sorrow, She did not hurry to cover it with easy words. She simply stayed and listened. Her mother, Queen Cassiopeia, was very different. Cassiopeia loved celebrations, beautiful fabrics, music, and admiring glances. She was graceful, and she knew it. Yet more than praise for herself, she loved hearing that her family was more beautiful and fortunate than any other. One evening, the royal family held a celebration in the palace gardens. Hundreds of tiny lamps glowed among the branches of the pomegranate trees. Musicians played beside a fountain, where the young moon trembled in the dark water. Cassiopeia sat near Andromeda, while the guests offered compliments to the princess. Every kind word filled the queen with greater pride. One guest said that Andromeda was as beautiful as a peaceful sea at dawn. Cassiopeia laughed and replied that even the sea nymphs could not compare with her daughter. The conversation continued, and her claims grew bolder. She declared that neither in the depths of the sea nor upon any distant shore could there be women more beautiful than those of her royal house. The guests smiled, believing the queen's words to be nothing more than playful exaggeration. But to the ancient people, the sea was alive. It could hear the words spoken near its shores, and it could remember them far longer than any human being imagined. Cepheus was sitting nearby. He noticed an elderly priest lower his eyes when Cassiopeia made her boast. For a moment, the king felt an unexpected uneasiness. He considered asking his wife to stop, but music filled the garden, the guests were laughing, and the evening seemed far too beautiful to disturb with dark suspicions. So Cepheus remained silent. The following morning, the sea looked just as it always had. Fishermen sailed out from the harbor. Baskets of fruit appeared in the market. Sunlight warmed the pale walls of the city. Several peaceful days passed. Then the wind changed. It came from the sea, although at that time of year it usually descended from the hills. The air grew damp and heavy. Birds abandoned the coastal rocks, and fishing boats began returning to the harbor earlier each afternoon. One night Cepheus woke to an unfamiliar sound. The sea was striking the shore, but it did not sound like an ordinary storm. Between the waves came a strange silence, as though the water were drawing back and gathering its strength. The king rose, wrapped a cloak around his shoulders, and stepped onto the terrace. Low clouds covered the horizon. Ship lanterns swung wildly in the harbor, while people rushed to secure their boats and carry supplies away from the waterfront. Cepheus called for the guards and went down into the city. Until dawn, the king worked beside his people. He helped them strengthen doors, clear the lower streets, and guide children toward houses farther up the hillside. Andromeda came with him. She carried water and warm blankets through the crowded streets. She comforted frightened children and held the hand of an elderly woman whose home stood close to the shore. By sunrise, the waves had reached the lowest part of the city. They left seaweed, broken wood, and wet sand across the stones. Yet the sea did not settle. With each passing day, the water moved closer. Fishermen began speaking of an enormous shadow they had seen moving beneath the surface, far beyond the harbor. The people remembered the words of Cassiopeia. Whispers spread through the streets. The sea nymphs had heard her boast. The ruler of the ocean had been angered, and a great creature, known in the ancient stories as Cepheus, had been sent toward their shores. Cepheus did not want to believe the rumors. He sent scouts along the coastline, questioned experienced sailors, and ordered the city walls to be strengthened. But neither stone nor ships could hold back the sea. At last the king set out to seek the counsel of an ancient oracle. The road carried him through dry and silent hills. He travelled with only a few companions. During the day, heat trembled above the ground. At night he rested beside a small fire and looked up at the stars. For the first time in many years, there were no advisers beside him, and no crowds waiting for an answer. And in that stillness, Cepheus returned again and again to the celebration in the palace garden. He remembered Cassiopeia's words. He saw the concern in the old priest's eyes. And most painfully of all, he remembered his own silence. Perhaps trouble does not always begin with a terrible act, he thought. Sometimes it begins in a single quiet moment, when someone senses that something is wrong but chooses not to speak. The oracle received the king inside a cool stone temple. The air smelled of smoke, dried herbs, and mountain wind. Sunlight entered through an opening in the ceiling and formed a narrow circle of gold upon the floor. The answer Cepheus received was more frightening than the storm. If the sea was to become calm again, Andromeda must be given to it. For a long time the king did not move. The oracle's words seemed to linger beneath the stone arches, repeating themselves in the silence. Cepheus wanted to demand another answer. He wanted to offer the oracle his treasure, his palace, every ship in the harbor, or even his own life. But the temple remained silent. The journey home seemed endless. At night, Cepheus lay awake beside the fire and thought of Andromeda. He remembered holding her in his arms when she was small. He remembered teaching her to recognize ships by the shapes of their sails, and the first time she had been brave enough to walk down to the sea alone. He was a king, and an entire city was waiting for him to save it. But he was also a father, and no royal law could tell him how to choose between thousands of frightened people and the one person who had become his whole world. When Cepheus finally returned, the people gathered outside the palace. They were exhausted and afraid. The water had taken homes and fishing boats. Food was becoming scarce. Parents held their children close, waiting for their king to tell them how they would survive another day. Cepheus looked into their tired faces and felt a burden unlike any he had carried before. That evening Cepheus told Andromeda what the oracle had said. They sat together upon the same terrace where they had once watched the sunrise. The sea below was almost black. Not a single fishing boat could be seen upon the water. The king struggled to speak. More than once his voice failed him, and he could not find the strength to continue. Andromeda listened. There was fear in her face, and she did not try to hide it. Yet beside that fear was something else, a deep tenderness for her father, who had been forced to bring her this terrible news. "You should not have carried this alone," she said softly. Cepheus closed his eyes. "I promised that I would always protect you." Andromeda placed her hand over his. "You have protected me all my life." They remained there for a long time, not as a king and princess, whose names would one day be preserved in legend, but simply as a father and daughter who wished they could hold the evening still and prevent the morning from coming. Cassiopeia joined them later. Nothing remained of her former pride. She knelt beside her daughter and wrapped her arms around her. She offered no excuses and made no beautiful speeches. Some regrets are simply too large for words. At dawn, Andromeda was taken to a rocky place beside the sea. The sky was grey and the wind moved through her pale clothing. Cepheus walked beside his daughter, holding her hand until they reached the final step, carved into the stone. The whole world seemed to have lost its colour. The king barely heard the sea, or the voices of the people around him. He could feel only the warmth of his daughter's fingers, and the knowledge that he would soon have to let them go. When Andromeda was left upon the rock, Cepheus refused to leave. His advisers begged him to return behind the city walls, but the king remained upon the shore. Cassiopeia stood beside him. Together, the people watched the sea as a dark wave began to rise in the distance. Then an unfamiliar sound passed across the sky. It was like the beating of a great wing. A young man appeared from behind the clouds. Winged sandals carried him through the air, and a curved sword shone in his hand. It was Perseus, returning from a distant journey. From high above, he saw Andromeda upon the rock, and descended toward her. He asked why she had been left there alone. Andromeda told him about the troubled sea, the suffering city, and the people she hoped to save. Perseus looked toward the water. He could have continued on his journey. No one had summoned him. No command had been given, and this was not his kingdom or his battle. But sometimes the decision to help is made by the heart, before the mind has time to consider the danger. Perseus rose into the air just as Cetus emerged from the sea. From the shore, Cepheus could see only fragments of the struggle. The silver flash of a sword, a winged shadow passing beneath the clouds, and wide circles spreading across the dark water. Time seemed to stop. Then the sea began to settle. The great shadow disappeared beneath the surface. The wind weakened, and the waves that had been striking the rocks slowly withdrew. Perseus returned to Andromeda and freed her. Cepheus ran to his daughter. He no longer thought of royal dignity, and he did not notice the people watching him. He held Andromeda as tightly as he could, as though he needed to be certain that she was truly there. Cassiopeia wept against her daughter's shoulder. Perseus stepped quietly away, allowing the family to have this moment together. The city did not hold a loud celebration that day. The people were too tired, and the sudden peace still felt almost impossible to believe. They emerged carefully from their houses and walked down toward the silent harbor. Some began gathering pieces of broken wood. Others lit fires and prepared warm food for their neighbors. Fishermen inspected their damaged boats and helped one another untangle the heavy, wet nets. In the palace, Andromeda sat beside an open window. Perseus stayed with her and spoke of the countries he had seen from high above, of distant islands, and of mountains whose peaks rose beyond the clouds. Cepheus listened from the adjoining room. Warmth was returning to his daughter's voice. Now and then she laughed, and every quiet laugh seemed to bring a small part of life back into the palace. That evening the king stepped onto the terrace. Below him the city was illuminated by scattered points of fire. Many houses had been damaged, and the harbor was nearly empty. But voices drifted upward from the courtyards. People were preparing food, they were putting their children to bed, and they were making plans for the morning. Cepheus understood then that the true work of a king did not begin when a crown was placed upon his head. It began on evenings like this, when the miracle was over, and the long ordinary work of rebuilding still remained. The walls would have to be repaired, Families who had lost their homes would need shelter. Ships would have to return to the harbor, and the king would have to learn to hear the quiet warnings he had once allowed music and praise to conceal. After that time, Cepheus changed. He began walking through the city more often without a royal procession. He listened to fishermen, craftsmen, and mothers who came to ask for help, and when he saw something unjust, he no longer mistook silence for wisdom. Cassiopeia also became quieter. When visitors praised Andromeda's beauty, the queen still smiled, but she no longer compared her daughter to goddesses or sea nymphs. She had learned that love does not need to prove itself through comparison, and that another person's beauty can never diminish our own. Andromeda and Perseus began spending more time together. They walked beside the restored harbor and climbed the hill beyond the city. Perseus showed her the stars that had guided him during his travels. Andromeda told him about the people living in the small houses below. Sometimes Cepheus watched them from a distance. He knew that one day his daughter would leave the palace. The thought brought sadness, but the old fear was gone. He wanted Andromeda to see the world she had always dreamed of seeing. He wanted her to choose her own path. One evening, the four of them gathered in the palace garden. There were no musicians and no crowd of guests. Bread and fruit rested upon a stone table, beside a simple jug of water. A few lamps burned quietly among the branches. They spoke about the rebuilding of the city, about the first ship that would sail from the harbor in the morning, and about the new trees that would be planted near the shore. Then, little by little, their conversation faded. Above them stretched a clear and peaceful sky. Perhaps it was on that evening that Cepheus first noticed a small figure, made from 5 stars, shaped almost like a house with a pointed roof. He could not have known that one day people would give those stars his name. According to the ancient story, when the earthly lives of the royal family came to an end, the gods preserved their memory in the night sky. Andromeda became a long constellation among the autumn stars. Perseus was placed nearby. Cassiopeia took her seat upon a celestial throne. And not far from them remained Cepheus, the king remembered by the heavens, not only for the crown he had worn, but for the long and difficult journey of his heart. The real constellation, Cepheus, lies in the northern sky. From many places in the northern hemisphere, it can be seen throughout the year. It is surrounded by Cassiopeia, Draco, and Ursa Minor. Its 5 most recognizable stars form a figure that resembles a child's simple drawing of a house. Cepheus is not one of the brightest constellations. To see it clearly, it helps to move away from the city lights and give your eyes time to become accustomed to the darkness. First, you can look for the familiar W shape of Cassiopeia. Then, let your gaze travel a little farther toward the quieter stars of her celestial neighbor. And perhaps that quietness suits Cepheus better than any brilliant display ever could. He does not outshine the others. He does not demand to be seen. He simply remains close to the constellations of his family, as though he is still watching over them across the centuries. Now imagine that the ancient city has fallen asleep. The harbor is silent. The fishing boats move gently upon the calm water, and their ropes make a faint creaking sound in the night. A small fire is burning upon the shore. Its warm light falls across the smooth stones and covers them with golden reflections. A few dry branches lie nearby. From time to time, one of them crackles softly, sending a tiny spark into the air. The sea breathes with a slow and steady rhythm. Warm water reaches the shore and slips away again, smoothing the sand. The breeze carries the scent of salt, earth warmed by the day, and the faintest trace of wood smoke. You can rest beside the fire and look up. There is Cassiopeia. There is Andromeda. Perseus shines nearby, and among the northern stars, Cepheus remains in the shape of a small celestial house. Nothing more is required of you tonight. Every decision can wait until morning. Every road has grown still. The ships have returned to the harbor. The doors of the houses are closed. One by one, the last lights in the windows are fading. Let your breathing become quieter. Feel the warmth of the fire. Listen to the water touching the shore. The night sky moves slowly above you, but its motion is almost impossible to see. It seems as though the stars themselves have become still in order to preserve the peace of this evening. With every breath, your body becomes a little heavier. With every exhale, your thoughts drift a little farther away. There is no need to remember the whole story. You can let go of the names, the palace, and the distant sea. Let only the feeling remain: a quiet shore, the warmth of a fire, and a sky filled with stars. Cepheus continues to shine in the north, calmly, quietly, close to those he loved. The fire is growing lower, but there is still enough warmth beside it. Starlight trembles upon the water. Night settles gently over the city, the sea, and the distant hills. And while you rest, the sky remains above the earth. The sea continues its slow and peaceful breathing, and the little starry house of Cepheus keeps its gentle light through the deep and silent night.